So we're a couple of minutes before the actual webinar gets started. And so for those of you who are already online, I just want to welcome you all. My name is Lavinia Plonka, and we're waiting for Arlene who is the technical assistant here, to set us up for the live stream on YouTube. Once she tells us that it's live and good to go, then we'll actually begin our interview with Dave. In the meantime, just a couple of little housekeeping things to know. One of them is that you have a chat function down at the bottom of your screen. And so all you have to do is click on that word chat, and that chat function is for all of you. You'll see that there's a way that you can converse with all panelists and attendees, which I recommend that you click on that. A couple of people have not realized that they need to click on that in order to communicate with each other. And you can write questions to each other, comments, make it an interactive event as we're discussing. Dave and I will try to stay on top of it, but we will be going back and forth. The other thing is that we're going to have two interactive events during it. Dave is going to lead us through a movement sequence. And so some people will have an opportunity, if they wish, to be on camera, which means if you want to be on camera during the movement sequence, I'll announce it and you will be able to use the raise hand function, and we'll pick a few people to just be on camera to explore the movement with Dave, and hopefully that will work. So if you think that you'd like to do that, then you need to be ready to be seen on camera, which means your camera better be working and your sound, although you won't need sound probably, but just to have everything ready so that when we choose you to get on screen, you're good to go. And I didn't ask Dave, is it a standing experience or a sitting experience?
Any position that allows you to have your foot flat on the floor. So you could be laying on your back, you could be kind of reclined, you could be standing, you could be in a chair.
So just to be ready, whatever position you choose, that your camera will be able to catch you. And then there will also be an opportunity to ask questions. And so same thing, we'll raise hands and ask a question. If you don't want to be seen and you have a question, there's a question section right at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your question in. And so I've gotten the go ahead. We are live and happening. So welcome to the Feldenkrais Awareness Summit. My name is Lavinia Plonka, and I'm your host for today. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Dave Clark. Dave is a researcher, an expert in all things cyber and software, and a Feldenkrais practitioner. And he's going to be speaking to us today about kind of the connections between research, science, pedagogy, interpretation, and much, much more. So I'm going to let him do the talking because he's the expert. And I hope I ask some good questions, and I hope you all have some good questions. So take it away, Dave.
Okay, so I have some slides. If I just start screen sharing, is that?
Yes, that will work.
Okay. I'm going to share my whole screen. So if you see anything funny, just pretend it didn't happen. Because I'm going to switch between two slideshows. But so I chose this title. It's meant to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I hope it's taken that way. And I'm basically going to try and share a paradox that I've encountered and I'm trying to deal with. I don't think we're going to solve it today. The plan is going to be, I'll talk about who I am a little bit. I'll talk for a bit. We'll do some movement. Lavinia and I will talk a little bit. We'll all talk a little bit. And then Stefan has this group that he's organized on Facebook along with the summit that he was trying to organize some conversation there as well, perhaps. And I want to be really clear, like this is not, this is like very light kind of romping around overview stuff, right? If you're truly interested in any of this stuff, I'm happy to help you find a richer, sort of more rigorous exposition. But don't take anything you hear today and like go repeating it as if it were like some kind of delivered ultimate truth, please. I also just want to, for the practitioners out there, I just want to put a shout out. There's a petition or a request to the IFF to consider changing some policies. If you're on the Feldy Forum or on the Feldenkrais practitioners around the world, check that out. And you can get in touch with, I think, Kim Wise or others about that. Okay. So who am I? I spent a long time in school. I learned about brains, learning. I got a master's in IT and a PhD at UC Berkeley. Worked as a data scientist at UC Berkeley, supporting social scientists. Decided I wanted to do my own work again. Came to Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore to do a clinical trial of mindful movement for ADHD. And you'll note that I didn't say Feldenkrais for ADHD. Ultimately, me and clinical trials did not get along very well. Now I write software to support transparent and reproducible science, and I consult for a Japanese educational company. So the big questions are like, what is clinical? What is hermeneutics? What is rigor? Do I have to submit? We'll get to all of that in turn. So we'll start with the logical song by Supertramp. I welcome you to sing along with me. When I was young, it seemed that life was so wonderful, right? And it goes on. Joyful, playful, beautiful, magical, miracle, happily, right? And then we get this turn into the second half of the first verse, right? But then they send me away to teach me how to be sensible, right? Logical, responsible, practical, dependable, and critical, to my point, clinical, right? So what we can infer from this, first we take a step back, right? We say like, well, there's this very clear kind of poetic structure. There's this setup of this extremely positive. Then we start at the second half with but, right? We're negating what came before and we're getting into the negative, right? And the words here are not extremely negative, right? They're like kind of adult, right? And one of the negative terms that's thrown in there is clinical. So we can take from this, right, that in 1979, when the band decided to record this song, right, that clinical was something that was being thrown in with something that is negative. It's like this kind of icky adult stuff that you just probably don't really want, but you have to do it anyway. Right, so what is hermeneutics? The reason I started that way was to hopefully keep people from feeling intimidated by these big words, but also it's actually an example of what hermeneutics is about, right? So it's the analysis of text. And there we were looking at, right, using that text to help really understand the feelings about clinical in 1979, at least for some group of people. Right, text has come to be pretty general. It could be movement of the body. It could be street signs. Originally, the term came from biblical scholars, but right, they were kind of doing stuff that Talmudic scholars were already doing. And this carries through to contemporary scholarship that's not terribly Christian at all, particularly in the humanistic and social sciences. And I love this statement. It's like so much text, we're not going to get into it. But I just want to put it here. It's on Wikipedia as a call-out quote, and it's really good. I'm going to give you like a synopsis extract on the next page. So the in practice, hermeneutics, people just write an inordinate amount of stuff using big words and technical ways that are very intimidating. It doesn't mean you can't do it, right? I mean, maybe you can't. It's like technique, right? Like painting. You know, if you really put in the time and you fuss, you can like get the perspective just right and you can convey things in this like really fussy way, right? But do you really need to? Probably not, right? The picture over there is Heidegger. He's a big deal. He sort of in many ways laid the groundwork for phenomenology, which is where we started including our own personal experience as part of the text, right? That can be included into our analysis of a particular object. They don't talk about them too much in the book, The Embodied Mind, which I highly recommend. It's even more rangy and synthetic than what I'm talking about. But he certainly was like the big precursor to a lot of the ideas in The Embodied Mind. All right, so back to that big long quote, right? These German objective hermeneutics people. One of the, I think, most critical pieces that they're claiming there is that from their perspective, the standard non-hermeneutic methods of quantitative social research can only be justified because they permit a shortcut in generating data, right? So they're like, in other words, saying that quantitative social research is not very good, right? Because it's kind of ignoring a great deal of sensitivity and sort of theory construction and refinement and the gathering of a much richer form of evidence versus, right, a quantitative approach. Generally, you're refining things down to a very limited couple of measures, like a couple of numbers, right? And so I encourage you to go read up on this on your own, but I'll briefly define objective hermeneutics more or less incorrectly as paying attention to the individuals, including the bodies, the social contexts, histories, etc. Right, so we're going to transition now to apply that to clinical stuff. Right, so can we apply that same critical filter suggested by the hermeneutics, the objective hermeneutics school? I say yes. I claim that clinical trials do not generally consider differences in individual experience too much. They don't really take social context into account. They don't take too much history into account, right? It's currently still very much in a mass production kind of uniform, this pill works for everybody kind of mindset. The question is, can we maybe get some progress out of bringing these ways of looking that come from like hermeneutics and critical theory to looking at clinical trials themselves? Or maybe another word that probably is a little less intimidating and more familiar would be a more humanistic way of looking at clinical trials. So if we investigate what is a clinical trial, right? The first clinical trial was actually arguably to find a cure for scurvy. So it was considered the first true clinical trial because it was actually randomized. The fella took a bunch of sailors and he divided them into groups of 2. And the 2 sailors that got lemons and oranges were much better off than the ones that were drinking seawater or, I don't know, a mix of turpentine and tamarind or other weird things. It's a great story. I highly recommend. It's on Wikipedia. You can read it. Right. So the critical turn in clinical trials was discovering the placebo effect and really starting to quantify it, right? And the initial like core aspect of clinical trials was to like eliminate the placebo effect, right? Like we don't want people just getting better. We want them, we want them to get better for like, because of a mechanism, right? That's like that we can understand. Right, and this allowed the production of like valuable mass-produced medical products and services, right? That could be delivered to like the entire U.S. population or the entire global population, right? And then you see that in today's climate, we're beginning to see like personalized medicine and extrinsic gamification of health. I think extrinsic is a really critical piece there. Most gamification systems are giving you some kind of like point system or some kind of something outside of your own experience, right? It's not like drawing attention to, oh, I feel better, or I like that I know something new, right? It's like more about the little bling, and the cute little character in the game gives you a thumbs up or something like that, right? So this is all and to be clear, I'm not a hardline anti-capitalist, right? But like this is all like pretty much wound up in the evolution of capital over time. Like the clinical trial just basically marches lockstep with the evolution of capital, right? From the time of crews that were dying on their trans-Pacific voyages up till today with like the methods of Google and Facebook and targeted advertising and so forth. Right. So I'm not saying like that's bad per se, but I think it's really important to understand like why and like that relationship is there. So that you don't delude yourself, into thinking, that there's some other, logic behind it. For a really fascinating and sometimes terrifying deep dive on the system of pharmaceutical trials, I would highly recommend Joe Dumet's book, Drugs for Life. I will be happy to share a link with this if people are concerned about having these references. Right, and I think it's also like really critical to see that historically and today there are many people propagating things that are probably bogus, right? Including intentionally propagating things that like they definitely just made up. The idea of having a system in place to help protect people from liars who are trying to just hurt them and take their money is good, right? Like I'm not I want to be clear. I'm being critical, but I'm not being, I don't want to get rid of these things. They serve very important functions. But, right, if you look at what the clinical trial is designed, what the objectives of the clinical trial are, right, I would argue that it's mostly to preserve human capital, right? And I think there's bigger issues of human development that we care about that are like ultimately just not going to fit into a model that's designed to like maintain the value of human capital, right? Again, not that human capital is bad. Like I'm really glad I have some, it let me buy this computer ultimately. But I think we want more than that. And I think the Feldenkrais method is about much more than that. So why did I do a clinical trial of Tai Chi for ADHD? I didn't actually say that before. Surprise. Apologies for those of you who feel betrayed. And it wasn't just lightweight. I wore my shirt, just so you know, like, Baltimore Tai Chi, that was a thing. I was into it. So per the logic of the NIH, right, a valuable piece of Tai Chi is that it can be more mass produced than Feldenkrais interventions, right? So at the time, from the perspective of being a Feldenkrais teacher, I was like, whoa, there's tons of Tai Chi teachers and there's tons of like Tai Chi students and there's a community. Having actually engaged now, like there's not even that many Tai Chi people. Like yoga people are all over the place, or just like, just straight circus or acrobatics or stuff. There's sort of movement disciplines that allow for individuals to develop in their own way, right? But that are just kind of conventional. Part of the logic was like this whole like to get a job you need experience kind of paradox, right? So reviewers of grants simply haven't heard of Feldenkrais, right? Like most people, if they've heard of it, they're like, oh, that's that weird thing, right? That my weird friend talked about. And I was prioritizing like just getting my foot in the door, right? It's very hard to get funding to do anything like this. And the community is not, as compared to like, I've done a variety of neuroscientific research, the community that's doing alternative stuff is like not as resourced, right? So they can't just welcome you in and be like, oh, great, come on in. There's like kind of a real hustle for limited resources. But in the, the plus column, I do think some of the best people are studying Chinese source traditions. I helped bring Kathy Kerr to a Feldenkrais conference one year, and she's amazing. Highly recommend you check out her work. And Peter Wayne at Harvard is also doing some really great work. I'll talk a little bit more about him later. Uh, and then again, why do Tai Chi? There is the benefit of there being a much clearer benchmark of whether you're actually teaching Tai Chi. Part of the logic of clinical trials is you are supposed to have like a repeatable thing that an external observer can look and be like, yep, they're doing it, right? And with Feldenkrais, that actually, I think, gets pretty hard. In part just because teachers of Tai Chi kind of agree, like there are forms and there's not that many of them and you're practicing them or not, right? Feldenkrais teachers will like disagree radically, like one will come in and be like, that was complete nonsense, right? Forget everything that person just said. So, I mean, that's that sort of internal lack of consensus is a barrier to doing something like a clinical trial on like the Feldenkrais method as a whole. So let me switch real quick. I did want to unpack the logic of the clinical trial, and I apologize. I had trouble getting this. Oh, pay no attention. Okay, so here's my slide on a trial structure, right? Just in case you're not familiar at all. Again, as with hermeneutics, clinical trials are not that complicated, right? The logic is you do some measurements, right? In this case, it was a 2-week period prior to training. It's mostly about controlling for things that might create a problem, right? So for example, with ADHD, you have to take the kids off their medications so that you can get a valid measure of how they actually perform, right? And there's a understanding of like how drugs flush out of the bloodstream so that you can be sure that they're off meds long enough to truly be off meds, right? Like that they're flushed out of their body. But the trial structure, you do the measurement, you do the training, you do the measurement, afterwards you compare, right? And you can see that in this graph here, right? There's like a circle around the pre-test measurement, circle around the post-test measurement, and you basically say like, did they get better? And there are statistics that are sort of the standard ways, the standard agreed ways for saying like that difference is large enough that we believe it's real, right? It's not just something that randomly happened. So back to, so the results of that, I'm writing up a paper right now. Parents reported improvements in symptoms. We found correlations with the clinical assessment of ADHD linked movements, right? So there's this kind of like awkwardness and sort of leakiness of movement that kids with ADHD will have that's kind of similar to younger kids in many ways. I can talk more about that later if you're curious. Interestingly, I'm also collaborating with folks who have been doing this sort of computerized training for ADHD, right? And there the parents also report reductions in symptoms, but they're getting correlated changes with these like cognitive computer tests, right? So it's interesting, right? Like, so you train on cognitive computer stuff and you get improvements on cognitive computer stuff, and that correlates with changes in symptoms. You do movement, you get stuff that's correlated with movement. So there's this curious way that even the supposed mechanisms are like not, they're different depending on the intervention you're using, right? And I think, I'm not going to spend too much time defining like my view of the Feldenkrais method, but it's interesting that Lavinia introduced me as a cyber expert, right? Because Feldenkrais, I would actually claim, was a cyber expert in the original sense of he really thought about information flows in the body and the mind and the environment. And, if you have like a holistic, cybernetic view or like view of information and control and whatnot, where do you start? Right? I mean, maybe it is Feldenkraisian to do a computerized cognitive training, right? Because that's like a good handle on helping kids get a certain part of how they process information. So transitioning now, right? We're gonna engage in more, hopefully, dialogue. Some things we might think about are, do we care about like the human capital focused logic of clinical trials? And I think probably we do, but probably we care about more than that. right? What models might be more appropriate? I mentioned Peter Wayne before. He's like a really great source of logic for how to like look at these messy things. He's initiated like emotional and systems biology frameworks for looking at Tai Chi. And just to be clear, like Peter is not going to do research for us unless we like give him $1 million, which we could potentially do, but like, you know, I just don't want people to get, I want people to be realistic. And then I think it's really useful to think about where our rigor comes from. You know, how do you know you're not just fooling yourself and your students? Are we giving people what they're paying for, right? Or are we giving them what we want to give them? And like, what actually are our objectives, right? Like, I'm not sure we agree entirely. So, and then lastly, I'd just like to, this is not really part of the talk per se, but it's like the frame that where I'm at with my practice of the method. And it's just, do we really have anything to offer towards the pressing issues facing us today, right? Like, I mean, lower back pain is important. You know, people being less stressed is important. But like, can we help reduce the exploitation of people, ecosystems, create seeds of lasting beauty, you know, and really, you know, help contribute to the development of us and the people we work with. So that's what I got. Thank you. I didn't answer the last question, but no, you don't have to submit, right? And if that's truly the case, I missed an apostrophe S there, right? No one obviously has to tell you. And I did go a little longer than like 5 minutes over what I was shooting for, but I think we can do still the quick movement thing. Lavinia, do you want to?
Yeah, if you would stop sharing your screen, that would be great. And got a little bit more to go before you. Should be on the top.
I see it.
Perfect. Thank you. And you know, thank you so much for that, because I don't know about other people, but when I see things like clinical trial, I go from sort of intimidation to resentment, because it always feels to me like, exactly as you said, we can't really measure everything about what happens to a Feldenkrais practitioner. Well, one of the questions that came up for me when you were speaking was, you spoke about how you really can't do this with Feldenkrais the way you do it with Tai Chi, because every Feldenkrais teacher is different, everything's different. But what if there was, like, for example, in this summit, we have an awareness through movement lesson that has been recorded in 17 different languages. Granted, each person has said it in more or less their own words, mostly because of copyright purpose. But what if there were a series of known lessons, for example, from the book Awareness Through Movement, where there was a set process that was studied? Would that count in some way towards this kind of a clinical trial?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, just so long as you're clear that what you're studying at that point is the efficacy of like this defined thing, right? And I think that's a great question, because it really illustrates how you're cleaving to the logic of the clinical trial, and I think you're cleaving away from like our pedagogy, which is like to be sensitive to like what is actually going on with like this person or these people in front of me right now. Mm-hmm. You know, and whether you're operating at the level of even lesson selection, or you're actually like, you know, which different people have different philosophies, right? But I mean, I'm very much more of like a sheepdog kind of teacher, right? Where like, I will just stop and go on diversions in the room, like, and try and make sure people are like, I have something I'm trying to get people to specifically explore, and I'm sort of nudging and getting people on track, right? I'm not just on a script. So you shift to a script and you lose a lot of that.
So in essence, though, what you're asking is for us to, in a way, change the way a certain aspect of society thinks about what is accurate and right. Because right? And
I
then
mean, yeah.
that goes right back to your final question about, well, what is our objective? Can we plant seeds of beauty? Can we, change the ecosystem through Feldenkrais? I mean, I'm always joking that we could save the world through one Feldenkrais lesson at a time, but it is our wish to make everything better. That can't be measured, can it? Or can it?
I mean, it can, but any such thing will lose at least something that we probably care about.
Right. So we're in kind of a catch-22, aren't we? But it's kind of an interesting place to be.
And I mean, I think, as is often the case with these like paradoxical things, as you say, like, well, okay, so we're just we're gonna remain aware of like the reality and maybe even the impossibility, and then just do it anyway.
But we make the impossible possible, Dave.
That's right. There you go.
So would you like to set us up for some movement while I see if I can get some people who would like to be on camera? Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, that's great.
So if there are people who are willing to be on camera, this would be a great time to raise your hands. And when you do that, I'll click on you and you will be promoted to panelist, and hopefully people will see you. So I'm starting with Stefan, and I'm adding the allow to talk function only because let's see what happens.
Hey, Stefan.
So Stefan,
I'm just reminding people that
are you allowed to speak? Yeah. Can I hear you? Can we hear you, Stefan? Just curious.
Now I've turned myself on. I hope you can hear me.
Okay, perfect. No, I just wanted to make sure because I'm still working with, here I am interviewing a technology expert and still working with my technology.
I'm going to mute myself now so you don't hear back.
Yeah, I would like all the participants to mute themselves for this. So let's see. How does that look to you, Dave? Good?
Yeah, it's fine.
3 people who are participating, and me, I guess.
So this is a really simple idea, and I'll have us just do like a tiny little bit of movement, and then I'll talk about some of the context that goes into it. And in particular, I'm going to say this is not necessarily an ATM. Maybe it is, but I think it sort of highlights like that's one of the challenges that's relevant to this broader issue, right? Like what even is our method? So find your foot, one or the other or both, but at least one, on the floor. You need the ball of your feet in particular needs to have a good clear connection with the floor. And then at first, just slowly, comfortably start to press into the ball of your feet so that you lift the heel, or at least lighten the heel away from the floor, right? So the ball of the foot is pressing, and then the heel is coming away. All right. And then you can let that go. You might notice I haven't actually tried that, like sitting on the floor in this particular position, and like, I'm noticing there's some parts of myself that are protesting. So, notice anything like that in yourself and do the adjustments that might help. But so let's take a step back into the context of like why I would be interested in that movement. Right. So I think the kernel of it goes way back to when I started studying Tai Chi. And there's this principle of the foot being nailed down, right? Or there's some kind of wellspring coming up out of the floor. Right? There's all these different ways of talking about this kind of like, and Ruthie Alon talks about the Roman sandals point. Right? There's like a lot of kind of quasi-mystical ideas about some kind of connection somewhere in the ball of the foot. And then you go forward a few years, and I had this really interesting experience of Jeff Haller and Edward Yu, both giving these brilliant workshops on like generating power in the foot, right? And Jeff's all like second metatarsal, and Edward's all like fourth and fifth metatarsal. And I'm all like, so which one is it? And so this is like my, and more recently I've been training Sistema, right? So I have this background of like still not really getting, right, the use of the foot, right? Like it's just so like gnarly and like foundational, right? That you know, it's like so rich. I haven't wrapped my head around it, and so I've been studying Sistema, and there, my teacher had me using that generation of force, pressing the ball of the foot, right? And you have this big muscle, right? This big muscle here on most people. Like, why is it so big, right? So one thing you can use that for is to not just like gently lift your heel, right? But to launch your knee, right? So if you need to suddenly respond to something, right, that's coming your way, you don't have to use the proximal muscles, right? You can actually initiate that movement with the ball of the foot pressing into the floor, right? And so that's mostly going to be with these more distal muscles. So, you know, you may be at different levels in terms of like being interested in sort of martial kind of application, or, you know, maybe dance or playfulness, whatever it is. But I'd like you to think about actually ramping up the effort of pressing into the floor, right? So that you're actually like getting the idea of like launching the knee a little bit somehow. Right. And as you get a feeling for that, right, and pause, make sure you're doing it in a way that's comfortable, right? You can always, right, this is kind of a funny instruction, right? Because I'm encouraging you to ramp up into like this more aggressive, energetic form of movement, but, you know, you want to keep it in the realm of comfort for sure. Right. And as you do that, you can start to think about, well, if I'm orienting in an improvisational way, right, could be coming from over here, could be coming from over here, right? I want to be able to use that force that I'm generating through the ball of the foot, right? And I want to be able to send my knee over there, right? I want to be able to send my knee this way, right? Send my knee straight ahead. Right, so that idea of really generating force through the ball of the foot, right? So the real interesting stuff for me was just later, right? And still, like, I mean, for, I don't know, months, at least a month now, you know, I've been sort of playing with this just in walking. Like, it's this idea of launching the leg from this forefoot is something you can play with all the time. I mean, not that you should play with it all the time, right? But at any time, you can. It's another game that you can play with how you're moving. And for me, it's been very interesting, right? And I'm not sure that this is like ATM, because it's more like an idea that is simple enough that I can just import it into a whole variety of activities, right? And the exploration is not bounded in, you know, 30, 40 an hour. It's kind of this diffuse ongoing exploration, right? Of like, you know, there's all these models of walking, or all these models of, you know, using the core, right, to mobilize your movement, right? And then, you know, but what about using that initiation that you can generate from the forefoot? Like, where can you fit that in? So that's sort of an open question that I invite you to pursue as you go. And it's one that's been very, like I said, it's been very valuable for me to explore that. And I would actually be curious what other Feldenkrais teachers end up doing or finding with that. I don't want to say too much about what I've personally done with it, and until you have a chance to explore it on your own. But I would be happy to hear about that. So that's it. That's the idea. I told Levin, I was sort of like toying around with the idea of actually doing an ATM around that, but it sort of serves my purposes better to do like is that ATM or not? Right? Like I'm sort of actively trying to create a boundary example. So yeah, so with that, I'm happy to transition more to verbal interaction. But if people want to,
well, I think that what you just said actually will definitely is bringing some questions up for people, because then when you think about the words awareness through movement, are they only about the specific lessons that were developed by Moshe Feldenkrais, or is anything that requires awareness through movement? It's an interesting question. But let's, if you attendees have questions, now would be the time to raise your hands so that I can promote you to a place where you can ask it out loud. And as people are formulating their questions and trying to decide that, there are a couple of questions that have appeared in the question box that is interesting. Somebody, Marilyn Bakun, asked, can we ask specific questions such as measurement of muscle tonus or the stress level measured by some machine? Not sure if you want to jump into that one.
Well, I mean, we can talk about, whatever people are interested in, honestly. I don't have too much of an agenda. That points to a broader question, right? Which is how do we, and like, what is the implication of choosing a measurement, right? And so I actually was really into this idea for a while, and I guess I still am. Like half of my work with this Japanese educational company, we're using machine vision and surveys and academic, sort of like databases and whatever we can get our hands on to get a measure of how kids are doing. And I think, methods of measuring autonomic stress, and also a good buddy of mine at Stanford, Pablo Paredes. I'll write his name in the chat just so people have it. So he's looking at modulation and stress not only affects the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system, it also directly affects the musculoskeletal nervous system, right? Mm-hmm. So you get changes in, pardon, I thought I had silenced that. You get changes in the musculoskeletal system where, I wish I could ask if people knew this game, but, well, you've used a mouse probably. So by using a mouse, you can create a model of the stiffness of the arm as if it were a spring, right? That has a certain stiffness. And as people get more stressed, you can measure their movement becomes more stiff. So, the way to measure this stuff is actively being developed. It's really neat, and I think if you think that's fun, you should do it, and you can find a way to fit it into, supporting your basic needs. In all honesty, I think where we're at, I would encourage us to put more effort into like deciding whether stress is relevant. And I think the initial path that I would take for that would be just honestly talking to my students, you know, and trying to bring a certain kind of rigor to that, right? I mean, maybe having like a semi-structured or a structured way of asking questions to my students. You know, one of the nice things about the Feldenkrais method is we actually have internal to our method ways of helping people gauge changes in, say, like skeletal-muscular stiffness or certain aspects of arousal, right? Like, you could ask people like very specific movement questions, like notice when you initiate this movement. And it's funny, as I'm saying this, like I'm realizing my movements are like actually quite sudden and kind of like jerky, right? But like, are they more on the sudden and jerky side, right? Or are they like a very smooth and continuous, you know, sort of minimal usage of force, right? Do you have the experience of less effort? Things like that, right? These are things that are classic questions inside of our own lessons, right? We don't bother, but the thing is, we never get the answer from anybody, right? We just let them keep the answer locked away in here. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's not like the law, you know. And I mean, it might it might mess up the lesson a little bit, right? But you know, if you want to know, there's nothing preventing you from asking, right, and getting an answer.
So then I could do my own research study with my students and write it up, but it wouldn't be the same, would it? You have to have some sort of outside monitoring system.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at pain research, right, it's only very recently that we've started to develop external measures of pain that seem to be as good as just giving people a 1 to 10 survey, right, where they circle a thing. So, I mean, within you know, the well-respected realms of medical research, just asking people how they feel is, you know, it's gotten it's an approved approach. So I don't think you need to have an external measurement. Mm-hmm. I think people like it, but it, you know, in terms of like what we, you know, what's the value of that to us? I think it's largely the appearance of rigor rather than actual rigor, right? Like using really complicated technological things seems rigorous. It doesn't mean it is. But again, if it seems cool, you know, and like you want to do it, I don't want to discourage that. Right. I will say in my own study, I did all kinds of, you know, brain imaging, brain stimulation, like really fancy little finger goniometers, they're called. They measure the finger flexion. None of that stuff was useful in the end. The useful thing was like a trained observer having the kid do a set of movements and just recording, you know, when they were moving their hand like this, did their other hand move a little bit? That kind of thing. Or like as they walk with their feet on the outside, do their hands also move a little bit? You know, like these sort of ideas of, you know, does effort in one part of the body extend to other parts of the body, for example? And that's something that happens all the time in ATM, in my experience. You know, like I'm doing something, all of a sudden my lips are like doing some weird thing, right? And then I get into the movement and it stops. Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, I think it might be more useful to look into like clinical measures, right? Because I mean, there are these clinical assessments that doctors are trained to do, and like, you know, clinical staff are trained to do that are like not, you know, they're not they're not readily accessible, right? Because they're meant to be only performed by trained practitioners of a certain stripe. Mm-hmm. But like that kind of thing probably would be really useful. Mm-hmm. You know, and so working with like a neurologist and being like, what kinds of stuff do you do to like just look at a patient and sort of scan and talk, and you know, there's so many things that a neurologist does that work incredibly well, you know, that machines can't even touch. Right. So you know, there I forget what it's called, but there's some kind of read, like a quick read, that a neurologist just looks at somebody, right, or a doctor looks at somebody and they come into the ER, they're like, this guy is doing bad, we need to take care of him, right? Mm-hmm. This guy's doing okay. Mm-hmm. We can put him in the waiting list. Right.
Well, there's tons of questions coming up. So as much as I want to be asking you questions, I'm going to say a couple and then we'll see if we can get a couple. But these were written. One of the questions was, this is from Colleen. Have you spent time observing, quote, spring in foot from toddler to adulthood to old age? And if so, would you mind commenting on that?
I haven't. That sounds interesting and fun.
Sounds like a lifelong study.
Yeah. Yeah, I really have just sort of gotten this myself. So no, I'm like not an expert. I'm just sharing this thing that I found that I thought was neat.
Right.
But I mean, I'd be happy to, I mean, like I said, you know, Jeff Haller, like people joke, right? Like, oh, metatarsal, blah, blah, you know, like he puts an inordinate amount of effort into this stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think it could be fun to just have like, this is the kind of, like, that could be a kind of rigor, right? Like, can we as a community just talk about these ways of thinking about the foot making contact with the floor, right? And like, you know, a structural versus a functional model. You know, there's like a lot there that we could dig into.
Absolutely. And in fact, that dovetails with Jan Hetherington's question. She was asking if you have ever resolved the question between Jeff's second metatarsal and Edward's fourth and fifth, or is this an ongoing inquiry built into your 4-foot push-off idea?
Kind of. So I just, it's funny. I mean, it really dovetails because I just mentioned this structure versus function, right? Idea. So if you're talking about structure, right, that's like pointing to a piece of the anatomy, like a bone, like fits this way. But if you're talking about function, right, function is specific to the context. And so this idea of the availability of the forefoot to support your leg moving in the direction that it's going, to me, resolves the structural issue, right? Because the structure depends on what's under your foot, which way is your leg going, are you trying to kick somebody, or are you trying to walk, right? Like, and then you just get a specific answer based on all that stuff, right? I mean, in a way, that's a good, I don't know if it's exactly hermeneutics, right? But it's a good like parallel to a hermeneutic approach, right? Where you don't get this nice, simple answer in a way, right? You unfortunately have to like bring the whole world into even the most trivial, you know, into answering the most trivial questions.
Because everything affects everything else, right?
Right.
So Daniela has her hand up. She's been patiently waiting. And I just want to give her an opportunity to speak before we wrap up. Okay, Daniela, let me see. You might be able to unmute yourself, but let me see if I can find your name again.
I unmuted myself.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah. First of all, I would love to say something about the metatarsals. I'm walking on the hill in the mountains, And my experience was that we need all the possibilities to put the foot like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. And then there is no discussion about which metatarsal, to my understanding. Maybe I understood something wrong. And it's a quality of the Feldenkrais method that there is no rule, because it depends, how my Yohanan said, on which kind of, if you go upwards or downwards, if you have stones on your or earth. So what do you think about this, Dave?
Either name is fine. I don't hear you disagreeing with anything that I said.
No, I don't disagree. It's
so,
just.
But yeah, I mean,
not, yeah.
The specific example of is it stones or is it earth?
Yeah.
Under your feet? I mean, I think that's a really great motivating example of what I mean. What I was trying to say, like, you need to bring the whole world into, right? Because like the ground might slide away from you. The ground might, and you need to be prepared for that. The ground, you might be barefoot walking on pointy little rocks, right? It's just, but so Jeff, to bring Jeff back in, right? Because Jeff has put a lot of this in my ear. He was observing me and others, like saying like, oh, you fell off of your foot somehow, right? And like that was like very mysterious to me. I was like, I guess I kind of get what he's saying, but changing to a functional idea of like, what can I do? Or like, what am I now unable to do because of the way my foot is on the ground? Like, that's something that I think you can attend to in a way that's a lot easier than like, am I on my foot, right? Being on your foot is kind of a structural thing.
Yeah.
Can I do X is a functional question.
Can we measure adaptive behavior? Like,
yes. So Karen Adolph, who is a student of Esther Thielen, does developmental work looking at like how kids adapt to all the crazy, I mean, like Esther did this really fun stuff, like putting kids into fish tanks and stuff, to change the weight, the effective weight of their legs. But you can put them on surfaces that all of a sudden they look visually the same and they get squishy. You can put them on surfaces that look dangerous but are not.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can, and people do. And I mean that could be a really fun thing, we could measure autonomic stress using, galvanic skin response, or we could put people through a Feldenkrais obstacle course, right?
A Feldenkrais what?
Obstacle course.
Obstacle course, yeah.
Right, with like slippery bits and, scary bits and disorienting bits, right? And see if people adapt better. Like that would be, that seems like to get at the core of like what we're trying to teach more than,
a
measured stress.
You bring me to the idea that it would be possible to create a set of tasks which you solve in movement at the beginning, in the middle of the project, and maybe if you make a longer project, like qualities, how people deal with tasks in movement, easy tasks, middle tasks, and this would be for totally healthy people who do not come to us because they have back pain. Till now, I did the research in my way with people, and I understood that I cannot really measure, let's say, if we measure the disc bulging or not bulging, we know that there are people with the bulging disc, they have no problems.
Yeah.
And others, they have, so this is not a measurement. So, but one thing which I could measure by asking questions is that after a project, all the participants told that they don't get helpless feelings when pain comes again. Like the pain doesn't come very much anymore, But this was not only the main thing. It was that they don't feel helpless anymore because they are specialists for themselves. But now that you speak about this, I think the tasks, it's a very good idea to go out of the medical illness model, to go to somewhere where really, how Moshe put it, is improving skill.
Right.
Like how can we improve skills for?
So don't mean to interrupt, but we're just about like near the end of our time, and I know that perhaps Dave, you wanted to say something in conclusion, and also Stefan just wanted to pop in to speak about the program that the two of you are doing. So I know that you have a lot there to share, Daniela. So maybe in the
No, it's fine.
You're done. Okay, good. All right, and I'm going to promote Stefan so that he can speak up, and then maybe we can finish that up. So I think you're on, Stefan. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, that's what I just did.
Good.
Thanks for your talk, and welcome everybody from Malmö. I just want to briefly pop up in person to actually extend an invitation to continue this conversation for a little bit longer afterwards for people who are really interested in actively pursuing research related to the Feldenkrais method. I personally have been pondering and also exchanging with staff over the last couple of years at several occasions, and I also kind of, in collaboration with IFF, was rebuilding the reference database of existing research to the Feldenkrais method. I'm going to post the link as well for those that might not know about that. So I just wanted to actually have a face along with the invitation that I have posted in the chat. And yeah, everybody who is really interested in personally actively doing something and supporting others who want to do something to hang on a little bit longer in related to Zoom link that I've posted. Thank you.
That was wonderful. And also thank you, Dave, for generously putting the link into your research work, being willing to work with people, at least in the Baltimore area. And I don't know if you have anything to say in conclusion.
Yeah, I didn't put that there, but yeah, I am happy.
I thought it said Dave Clark. Sorry, someone put it.
It's there. Another David, I think, put it there.
Wow.
But yeah, also the Jeff shoe salesman thing is a great factoid. So
that's just between you and me.
Oh, whoops.
That's okay.
Well, not anymore.
Not anymore. That's his secret past.
But I think I would, sort of like the counterpart to Stefan's invitation is that I think there's a certain amount of, that we don't have to be like so serious about it, right? But just like curious exploration, making little games, things that are actually appealing that like, our students might want to do and that, other people might want to do. It doesn't have to be fundable. It doesn't have to be deep. It can just be, enriching our understanding and finding ways to communicate, right? Like a lot of what we communicate is so mysterious, right? So like finding new ways to communicate could be so valuable.
Still needs to be done though.
Yeah. No, I'm just encouraging, right? So there's like this, do you want to do like formal research that's like targeting, academic publication? Like, do it, but also, do you want to just screw around? Do that too. Like it's all great. It's all valuable.
Well, thank you so much for your time, your thoughts, your big words. We've all learned a lot today. That was fantastic. And just to let everyone know, the summit continues on until May 8th. So hopefully you will join us all for some more learning and opportunities to exchange with some of the people who are interacting with the Feldenkrais method. Thank you, Dave Clark, and I'm Lavinia Plonka. Until we meet again.
Thanks, everyone.